Welcome to the UNU Conversation series. I'm honored to be here tonight with Dr. Bruce Jones, who is the Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, and we're here to talk about the changing international order and the risk of conflict. And Bruce, if I may, I'd just like to ask, with that first segment of our title, Changing International Order, it seems that we're at a little bit of a moment in international relations. Conflict in the Middle East, conflict in Ukraine, tensions in Northeast Asia. Is the international order changing?
I think we're at an important inflection point. We still see important, sustained cooperation between the great powers, which is the bedrock of international order. We see it on climate issues, we see it on some aspects of the counterterrorism issue, and very important, we see it on proliferation questions. We saw it on the P5+1 process for Iran, and very interesting, we see it in increased cooperation between the United States and China on North Korea. So there are some positives. But at the same time, I think we're genuinely confronting a set of processes, a set of challenges that risk eroding the international order in a more fundamental way. The rapid deterioration in U.S.-Russia relations and the Crimea crisis, where Russia very explicitly violated Article 2 of the Charter, which is the bedrock of the UN. Of course, the United States had done, if not exactly similar things, and certainly problematic things in terms of the Charter in Iraq, but Russia's violation is more severe. The breakdown of U.S.-Russia relations, the blockages that implies in the UN Security Council. I think in a serious way mounting tensions between the United States and China, as well as between China and the rest of the region in terms of security in the Northeast Asian sphere, the Middle East crisis, and I think very importantly what a friend and colleague of mine referred to the Vox Populi crisis. In other words, genuine distress among Western middle classes, a rise of nationalist sentiment that is worrying in terms of what it portends for the reaction that we have to major crises. So all of these are there. There are positives and there are negatives. The attitudes and the actions of China, of Russia, and the United States in the next few years will be, I think, determinant as to whether we are in a reasonably stable international order or whether we genuinely see a kind of coming apart of the wheels of the system that we've had for 70 years.
In all of those crises and in all of those successes, the United States has played a pivotal role. And your book from, I think it's almost precisely 2 years ago today, Still Ours to Lead, talks about the need for the United States to play a leadership role in the international system. Is that still true? Is there still space for the United States to lead? And what can it do to build restraint into the international system?
It's a very important question, and let me take them each, the two parts, each of them. 3 or 4 years ago, a little bit more than that, there was a lot of excited talk and kind of happy talk and frankly quite loose talk about the emerging multipolar system. Multipolarity, in my mind, has two implications. One, that you would have a set of powers who genuinely had followers, allies, were constituted poles in and of themselves, which we don't see. China does not have a set of allies that are working with it. Russia does not have allies in any meaningful sense of that term. Only the United States has a genuine alliance system. And the second thing is that people were talking about multipolarity as if it was going to be a benign multipolarity, that having moved away from the negative scenario of the bipolar system during the Cold War to what I view as a benign system, but not already did view as a benign system, of the unipolar system in the post-Cold War. People saw the injustices and the sort of domination of the United States, and they looked towards a multipolar system in which a lot more actors would be able to share in power and share in decision making. Well, that was, in my view, a fantasy. If we see a distribution of power, what is likely to come along with that is a breakdown of order and a rapid move into conflict between the powers. In fact, the United States still does have a preponderance of power, and the United States and its allies have a huge preponderance of power. If you look at the economic weight of the West collectively, the United States, the EU, Japan, Korea, you're talking about 70% of world GDP. You look in military terms, it's 80% of world GDP. And so the United States and its allies still has the capacity to play a leadership role. I think what's very interesting is that China, India, Brazil, all those countries in their sober moments, recognize perfectly well that the alternative to the U.S. playing a leadership role is not them playing a leadership role. It's not benign multilateralism. It's chaos.
Yeah.
And they recognize that. Russia is in a different position, unfortunately. The real challenge in my mind is that the U.S. is in a sort of political disarray right now. So the question of whether we will choose to lead is very much alive. And the West as a whole is in disarray. Europe's in a muddle. Japan and Korea are, spending time worrying about historical debates between themselves rather than how they're going to grapple together with the China question. The West as a whole has not come together around the issues of China, does not come together around the issues of the Middle East, does not come together around economic issues. So the U.S. still is the only option for leadership, but there's an increasing doubt in my mind about whether we'll see the kind of U.S. leadership that we need to see if we're going to avoid a breakdown of order. Which
is very worrying. I mean, one of the critical and under-discussed facets of U.S. leadership has been its force projection, its protection of Chinese shipping lanes, for example, which nobody really discusses. The U.S. plays a critical balancing military role in the world. Is there a substantial risk of the U.S. pulling back from that role? And what can the U.S. do, if anything, to try and invest that role in others or find alliances to help share that burden?
Yeah. Well, as you know very well, we're in an election season where there are serious candidates in both parties who advocate a dramatic change in American foreign policy. Trump most bombastically, but Bernie Sanders is in a very similar place in terms of wanting to see a substantially more inward-looking United States, anti-free trade, etc. I think the most likely outcome of the election is not that that policy voice ends up capturing the presidency, but it's a live debate, and we can't pretend that it's not. So there is a risk. I think even if somebody like Hillary Clinton becomes president, who's much more aligned with a traditional sense of American foreign policy, force projection, the balancing role that we play, the trade protection role that we play, we can't ignore the fact that both parties had popular candidates who are not invested, and then we have to pay attention to what that's about. I think it's about a number of things. And the American middle class was hurt quite badly by the global financial crisis, and people have not paid attention to that and not dealt with the repercussions of that. There's, of course, a different piece of this, which is a kind of racist and nationalist politics inside, particularly the Republican Party, which has sort of come home to roost. But there's also kind of, I think, a basic failure on the part of the foreign policy elites, think tankers, I would include myself, in explaining to the American public what it is, what role we play, and why it matters. So people ask the question, well, why on earth are we protecting the sea lanes in the South China Sea? What on earth does that have to do? Why should American ships be 6,000 miles away, 12 miles off the coast of China? Surely we can pull back from that. But of course the reality is that every inch that we pull back will be immediately occupied by 4 competing navies, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indian, the Vietnamese, and others. And we'll see a race to an escalating race of kind of arms race in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and a risk of conflict.
Can we pick up on that regional question? Because there's 2 key regions, it seems to us, that are in play, if you will. Asia, Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia, from Korea to the South China Sea problems, and China's increased assertiveness militarily and politically, and of course the Middle East, which is in strife and chaos. What are the consequences of a decline in the institutions of global order for these 2 regions, or what might you see happening?
Yeah, 3 regions in play, because Europe is also in play. And Russian sort of gray penetration, so to speak, of European political parties and financing in Eastern Europe is pretty substantial, and I think we have to be quite worried about that issue as well. So I think the place where I would be most worried about great power confrontation is Asia. You have Japan, you have China, you have India, you have the United States, you have Russia, all of whom have huge stakes, all of whom have military capabilities, substantial ones, Korea to a certain degree as well. And as much as the Chinese, on the face of it, don't like American dominance in Asia, at the same time they understand perfectly well that the alternative to that dominance is conflict with their neighbors. And so you see this sort of strange, funny push-pull relationship between the United States and China, where China would like to have a greater role, but they don't necessarily want the U.S. to leave too quickly because of the consequences that would follow. So were the United States to pull back substantially, I think that we would be in a much more volatile situation in Asia. That's one. Europe, it's essentially a kind of question of the politics of unity in the West, which matters a great deal. In the Middle East, I think that the U.S. has had a long series of policy mistakes in the United States, to say the least, and they have accumulated. Now, the Middle East is in crisis not only, or not even primarily, because of American policy mistakes. Yeah. These are authoritarian regimes that have been backed by the United States, but they're authoritarian regimes even if they weren't, and we're dealing with the consequences of decades of bad governance in the Middle East, and it's going to take decades to get out of it. The real issue is going to be whether we see what we're seeing in Syria, which is essentially regional and geopolitical proxy warfare, making it all much bloodier and much harder to resolve, or do we end up seeing things like we're watching in Afghanistan and parts of Iraq, where the great powers see a shared interest in managing the conflicts because they all fear the sort of outflow of Islamic terrorism. And right now we're seeing both. What the balance between those two things, I think, will be determinant about whether the Middle East is a tough, difficult, but sort of managed and contained issue, or whether it really sucks in a wider set of geopolitical conflicts and generates a wider outflow of bad things, particularly in the form of Islamic terrorism.
And now we are at the United Nations, and one of the discussions that happens here increasingly is the question of whether the UN will play a role in the Middle East and in stabilization, whether the great powers will turn to the United Nations. So let me ask you, if you were advising the next Secretary General, would you tell her, hopefully, to see the Middle East as an opportunity, or to see it as a risk where the likelihood of failure outweighs the opportunities and something to be handled with kid gloves?
I think when we write the history of the UN, or as we write the history of the UN, we should see it already having done two great things. It was the handmaiden to decolonization, and that was an extraordinarily important function that the UN played at an important time in international politics. And then in the post-Cold War period, and essentially between 1995 and 2010, let's say, through a very robust set of innovations in peacekeeping and peace building and conflict management and humanitarian affairs, the UN played a very important role in reducing the level of conflict in the world. It wasn't the most important actor, but it was a hugely contributing actor to very substantially declining levels of war in the world. If over the next 20 years, and I think it will be 20 years, that we deal with violent, bloody, brutal conflict across parts of the Middle East, the UN is a bystander to that. Then we will describe the UN as having done useful things up until about the 2010 period, and then withered back into a kind of irrelevance that it had during the Cold War, or semi-irrelevance that it had during the Cold War. So I would hope that the next Secretary General understands that she has to find a way to be useful in the Middle East. That is going to be tough. It requires the major powers to work through the UN. It requires advanced militaries to be willing to put troops back into the UN, as some have started to do, the Dutch in Mali and the Koreans and Japan has promised to do, and etc. We have yet to see all of that, but we could. And it requires some serious management reform at the UN, which is in bad managerial shape and needs to be improved. So it's going to take a lot of work. But the reason I think it might happen is that there is no real alternative. There's no regional organization that can play a conflict management role in the Middle East. The politics of the Arab world mean it's impossible for NATO and the EU and sort of explicitly Western institutions to play that role. So the alternative is the UN. And I suspect we will see times when the powers will turn to the UN to try to play some sort of stabilizing and consolidating and hopefully eventually constructive role in the Middle East. And that will be very tough, but that's what's ahead of us, and that's what we have to prepare for.
So you've laid down a set of challenges for a Secretary General, and she will have to be a master politician to unite the great powers. a master of management to fix an organization that has operational challenges. But the UN is also a normative organization. At its heart rests the charter to which you've referred. But at the same time, as you've just ended, it's the provider of last resort. It's who we turn to, or who the world turns to when it has nowhere else to turn. How does a Secretary-General navigate that tension between being a custodian of global moral standards, if you will, or a certain global ethic of non-conflict, and being the person who you are turned to when there is nothing else left to turn, nowhere else left to turn?
In my mind, the political qualifications of the Secretary-General are the important one. The management piece, a wise Secretary-General will have a very solid manager as their immediate number two and invest a lot of authority in that person and give that person the space and the political support they need to kind of clean up the management pieces. They'll have to pay some attention themselves, but I don't think you need a manager in the first instance. You need a political leader who understands that management is important and empowers other people. In terms of the normative role and the political role, I think the only possible play for an effective Secretary-General is to be a charter fundamentalist, is to look at the core principles of the charter. Restraint from the use of force in international relations, cooperation against common threats. This is the core of it. All the rest is other stuff that we can add to it, but the core principles of the charter, it seems to me to be fundamental. And the politics have to be about being creative, quiet, public, whatever set of tools you have, to work with the major powers and those who are willing to contribute, to create space, to create incentives for the powers when they are going to choose to try to solve problems. You can't make them do it. But if the powers choose a path of restraint, then the UN can be a very important tool at their disposal, premised on the charter. So you don't budge away from the charter. You should be a charter fundamentalist. But let's not pretend that it's in the Secretary-General's hands. Washington, Beijing, Moscow have to choose a path of restraint. Brussels, Tokyo, Seoul, a number of other countries have to urge them to do so, have to put a lot of effort into urging them to do so. But ultimately, a small number of countries are either going to choose a path of restraint or not. If they don't, we'll be in a very dangerous place. If they do, then an effective SecGen resting on the charter can be an important part of how it is that we find a pathway back to restraint.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones, for reminding us of the fundamental importance of the UN Charter. And thank you very much for watching us. This is the UNU Conversation series. Good evening.
Thank you.